Welcome to Go Green Radio, everybody. So glad that you could join us today. We're talking about a very timely and important topic, and that is protecting children from extreme heat in schools. A lot of schools throughout the US just never needed air conditioning, and now they're dealing with record-breaking temperatures during the school year without the infrastructure to deal with that. We have two amazing individuals on the show today to help us unpack this issue, talk about how this is impacting children, how the infrastructure in schools is playing a part in this problem, and furthermore, what kind of public policy we could employ to directly impact this issue. We have Autumn Burton, who is a senior associate of climate, health, and environment at the Federation of American Scientists. And we have Dr. Hailey Gibbs, who is an Associate Director of Early Childhood Policy at the Center for American Progress. Welcome to Go Green Radio, ladies. So glad to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having us. Glad to be
Well,
here.
Autumn, I'm going to start with you. I want to start our conversation by focusing on the children, and then we'll get into infrastructure and policy. What is different about a child's body versus an adult's body that makes it more difficult for kids to deal with extreme heat?
Yeah, Jill, that's a great place to start. So, when we look to the research literature, I would say overall there are five overarching factors that drives children's increased vulnerability to the negative health outcomes from extreme heat. So, for one, extreme heat tends to affect babies and young children more than adults because simply they have smaller bodies that heat up more quickly and they also have less capacity to release heat via sweating. Additionally, the systems in our body that regulate our temperature, but for children and in young infants, these systems tend to be less developed and therefore less efficient. On top of this as well, young children, especially as well as infants, tend to be dependent on adults, their parents, their caretakers, etc., to provide them with water and to protect them from unsafe outdoor environments during extreme temperature events. And oftentimes, their caretakers may not fully understand the level of severity when children are experiencing extreme heat symptoms until oftentimes it's too late. On top of this as well, young children also tend to be more prone to dehydration than adults because a larger percentage of their body weight is water. And the last key factor I'll say as well is that compared to adults, children tend to spend more time active outdoors, with recess, outdoor sports, walking to and from school, all these things, which are in general great to do, but during extreme heat events, that means they're getting more exposure to these higher ambient temperatures. And I will say as well, it's important to note here that on top of these five factors that I just mentioned, children and adolescents who have chronic health conditions like asthma or diabetes, for example, are also even more susceptible to heat-related illnesses. So basically, their chronic conditions are compounded by extreme heat. So overall, all these factors, these different physiological and social differences mean that children face increased risk from extreme heat and the accompanying heat-related illnesses and stress.
You said something really important, a lot of things that were really important in there, but the one that really came out to me is when you said, that children are dependent upon their caregivers, and that includes teachers. And a lot of times we find that kids are dehydrated in school because, first of all, there might be one drinking fountain for 50 kids, and the line can get long, and a lot of kids won't stand in it. The other thing is that, teachers, especially of young students, cannot manage the classroom when everybody's got to go to the bathroom because they are well hydrated. And so we have been finding a lot of instances where kids are really dehydrated, and there's significant problems associated with that. And I want to get into that with you, Hailey. When we talk about kids being exposed to extreme heat, it's not just that they're sweaty and uncomfortable. Talk to us about some of the health impacts that kids can suffer with prolonged exposure to extreme heat.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think it's really helpful to start by thinking about what extreme heat really is. This is beyond the sort of prototypical "it's too hot and I don't like it" kind of weather. Extreme heat refers to a period of prolonged and unusually high heat and humidity that might be atypical for a given region or season, and we know it to be driven by, exacerbated by climate change. Autumn touched on this a little bit already. Everyone is to some degree vulnerable to extreme heat through exposure to those high temperatures and high humidity. But for young children, for both social and biological reasons, they are particularly at risk to those health consequences. And I should note that exposure to extreme heat conditions poses risks even at the earliest stages of development. Autumn talked a little bit about the risk for babies. But for instance, exposure during pregnancy, especially later in pregnancy, has been associated with shortened gestational periods or premature birth, which poses risks to the health of the fetus, as well as increasing the risk of low birth weight. We also see increased risk for things like gestational diabetes and hypertension, which can be dangerous for the health of the pregnancy, both for the child and for the parent. And extreme heat dramatically widens disparities in maternal health. During heat waves, pregnant women experience about a 16% increase in the risk of preterm birth and can have up to a 40% increase in the rate of stillbirths. And those estimates are double for pregnant Black and Hispanic women. For young children, on the topic of the time that they're spending in their childcare programs or in school settings, research has shown that chronic exposure to extreme heat is associated with gut problems related to dehydration. Jill, you were just talking about how big of a problem this is in school settings for a number of different reasons. And that can lead to different kinds of conditions like leaky gut, where the gut lining becomes semi-permeable, which also increases the risk of infection. High temperatures are also associated after prolonged exposure with muscle breakdown, organ dysfunction, like problems with the kidneys, skin, and brain, problems with the immune system, which is still developing in young children, and even heat-related deaths. Extreme heat is also associated with reductions in sleep quality, which, especially for young children, is quite harmful. And that's associated with increases in stress and behavioral problems. And this is all also associated with decreases in cognitive function. So it's a really concerning phenomenon. And the severity of those health consequences, the long-term impacts that they have for young kids, and the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme heat conditions that we're facing now is why we have to take immediate action to address this crisis.
Well said. Well said. Autumn, talk to us about what we know about children's ability to learn in overheated classrooms.
Yeah. So when we look in addition to a lot of those really critical health consequences that Haley was just discussing, we see that chronic high heat exposure can have impacts on children's learning as well as their overall well-being in school and into their broader lives. So for one, as Haley mentioned, we know that higher temperatures have significant impacts on cognitive functioning. But when we look to the classroom setting specifically, we see that extreme heat also decreases the effectiveness of learning time. And this happens for a few reasons, particularly because hot weather impacts children's behaviors, making them more prone to restlessness, irritability, and just overall just mental distress, like just makes you very uncomfortable and makes it really a challenge to focus when you're experiencing high temperatures, especially when combined with high humidity. On top of this, extreme heat exposure, especially when it's on like a chronic level, can also disrupt sleep patterns, making it harder to fall asleep and stay awake. And then when you're having a hard time getting enough sleep at night, this in turn further affects your mood and also makes it doubly challenged to focus when you get back to school the next day. So all these factors have a significant impact on children's ability to learn and reduces their ability to succeed in school. And we see that there is a direct correlation between these higher temperatures and school performances. For one, we see that for each 1 degree increase in average annual temperatures in school districts that don't have proper heat protections or air conditioning, we see that there is in turn a 1% drop in learning. And
Mm.
these impacts aren't just concentrated to, one singular school year. The EPA published a study a few years ago that found that these losses in learning could then in turn translate to nearly $7 billion in annual future income losses due to these losses of school performance outcomes. And this is, of course, if our current trends that we're seeing continue to escalate at the scale that they are.
Wow. Wow. That's really impactful. That was great information. Haley, talk to us about how can heat impact indoor air quality in a school or in a classroom besides just thermal comfort? What are some other impacts that we might see in IAQ?
Yeah, so extreme heat degrades indoor air quality because the air becomes more stagnant and it winds up trapping airborne pollutants, which can increase the risk of different kinds of respiratory conditions like asthma, which, as Autumn already noted, young children are at an elevated risk for. It also increases the level of humidity in the room, which creates a friendlier environment for other kinds of toxins to grow or to proliferate, including mold and mildew, even things like dust mites and other pests. And those kinds of conditions also put a lot of strain on heating, ventilation, and air conditioning or HVAC systems. Even, if they're even available in that indoor environment, which they aren't always. And aging or poorly maintained systems can also contribute to that problem because they can further circulate dust, pollen, and other kinds of pollutants that are really agitating for young children's health. And with prolonged exposure, poor air quality, in addition to heat-related fatigue and dehydration, can cause dizziness, headaches, gut discomfort, respiratory problems, increases with anxiety and sleep disturbances, all of those different kinds of health consequences that we know are associated with extreme heat. So it really becomes a sort of double down problem for young children.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, let me set you up for this awesome conversation we're going to have. We're going to talk to Autumn about some of the guidance that health professionals have for what is safe in terms of heat in the classroom. And then we're going to pivot into talking about the state of school infrastructure in the United States and how this is playing a role in whether or not we can protect children's health and protect their safety from extreme heat in the classroom. So don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio, everybody. So glad that you could join us today because we are talking about something that is very timely. A lot of school districts are back to school now, and many of them are experiencing extreme heat. And many of them do not have the HVAC systems or portable air conditioners to deal with that extreme heat because they never had this problem before. And so in this segment, we're going to be talking a little bit more about what is safe, what is not for kids when it comes to heat in the classroom, and the state of American public school and other schools' infrastructure. So, Autumn, I want to go to you. What guidance exists from health professionals and public health agencies on a safe upper indoor air temperature for children? And how have states or school systems translated that guidance into enforceable policies?
Yeah, so Joe, there's currently not a national pediatric maximum indoor temperature standard, but what there is a growing number of states and local governments that are employing guidance from public health officials to develop these policies that require heat interventions when we reach specific temperature thresholds. So I want to shout out New York State as a key example of leadership on this front, as they are employing these policies that are based around these protocols and guidance that's been developed by different public health professionals when it comes to extreme heat. So just at the end of last year, New York State Governor Kathy Hochul passed the first ever law of its kind in the nation that established an 88-degree maximum temperature standard for classrooms and support spaces, and also requires for school administrators, when the temperatures reach that level, to have a plan for how they will remove the students and staff from these high temperature spots to safer, more lower temperature and cool down places, making sure that the plans and protocols are as practical as possible for the school districts to employ. And the law also requires the school district to make sure that the schools take action to relieve heat-related discomfort when temperatures in classrooms reach 82 degrees. So some of these actions could include, more simple things that are accessible, like pulling down shades or turning on fans, opening up the door, making sure people have water breaks, things of that nature. But still, it's important to make sure that the schools have these plans and protocols in place as soon as they see that the temperature is getting above that 82-degree mark. So that law, I think, is wonderful. It really provides a model that other states can employ. And actually, it just went into effect a few days ago on September 1st. So I imagine we're going to see in the coming months the great effects that this law being implemented will have. Another policy that I'll also flag as well, that's also based upon the evidence that we have from public health experts, is California's OSHA has an indoor heat standard that is not directly focused solely on schools, but rather indoor and outdoor workplaces. And with this standard, it includes coverage for schools because teachers, school administrators, cafeteria support workers, janitors, etc., they're all considered critical workers that do need protection when indoor temperatures reach unsafe levels. So basically, this standard triggers heat protections when indoor spaces reach 82 degrees and above. And it requires that these workplaces are set to have plans and protocols that will make sure that the workplaces are cooled down to safer levels. So yeah, we do have a few different examples of these models at the state and local level, even though we don't have like a uniform standard, which would be great for us to have. But in the meantime, it's important for us to focus on how we can look to what existing models there are and how state and local governments can advance those solutions in their own jurisdictions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hailey, I'm going to pivot to you. As I mentioned before we went on break, some parts of the US have never had to worry about having air conditioning in their schools, but things are changing. Talk to us about some of these school districts that do not have air conditioning infrastructure and how extreme heat is impacting them.
Yeah, totally. This is a very true problem. For instance, more northern parts of the country that in past decades maybe had more stable, lower temperature climates are starting to see consistently higher temperatures and more humid conditions because of advancing climate change. But this trend is nationwide. I mean, the average school building in the US is more than half a century old, and the funding models that we have to support public education are both limited and inequitable, making it difficult for school districts to make those kinds of facility upgrades like installing air conditioning and updating ventilation systems that they need to. More than three-quarters of public school districts across the country use property tax revenue to fund their public school needs, which means that areas with higher rates of poverty are often unable to raise sufficient resources because of lower property values. And so, as a result, they tend to rely more heavily on state funding for facilities expenses, which puts them at the mercy of the funding and policy decisions of their state leadership and legislatures. As of this year, there are tens of thousands of public schools that need to make updates to or even install for the first time HVAC systems to meet their cooling needs. And the combined cost of that work is estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $4.4 billion nationally. High temperatures, as we've already discussed, have significant negative impacts on health and learning. They slow cognitive function, impair sleep quality, affect behavioral health. All of those different kinds of things have cascading impacts on kids' school performance. They mean slower reaction times on tests, lower scores overall, greater learning loss. Autumn talked about this correlation between degree increases in temperature with drops in school performance. And to add to that, we've read and written about a study of 4.5 million New York City public school exit exams that found that students who took that exam on a 90-degree Fahrenheit day were nearly 11% less likely to pass compared to students who took that same test on a 74-degree day. And while that might seem like just one test, just one outcome, that's a considerable sample size. And the researchers also found longer term consequences. So that decreased performance reduced students' likelihood of graduating on time by almost 3%, which is about 135,000 kids. And both Autumn and I have mentioned issues with behavioral health too. High heat days are associated with a higher rate of disciplinary referrals among K-12 students in schools without air conditioning, which also means those kids have less time in the classroom, less instructional time, leading to even greater impacts on their engagement and learning.
Absolutely. Autumn, my gut tells me that there are parts of the country where the impact of this is even greater. Um, Talk to us about how low income and rural schools are particularly impacted by poor infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely, Jill. Your gut is exactly right. When we talk about these impacts upon learning, we see that these are disproportionately affecting students in low-income school districts, and this often correlates with race because of systemic and historic redlining. And then within these districts, we see that they have been historically under-resourced and underinvested in, and as a result, they have less capacity to fund these highly necessary school improvement projects to enhance resilience to extreme heat. And then currently, a lot of these school buildings don't have sufficient cooling mechanisms or any at all in the first place. So, as Hailey was touching on a moment ago, these disproportionate impacts foster increased academic and economic inequities between students who are coming from higher income school districts versus those in lower income school districts. On top of this as well, we also see that when students have higher exposure to extreme heat days, there's also a correlation to higher numbers of emergency room visits. And this is particularly
Mm.
pronounced for the 1 in 6 children that are living at or below federal poverty levels or on fixed incomes. And when we also look specifically to rural areas, we see that this is even more pronounced because in rural areas, there's an even higher rate of children living in poverty. Because nationally, more than 1 in 5 rural children are living in poverty. So essentially, extreme heat is not only an issue that disproportionately affects students in low income school districts, it's also an issue that is very highly pronounced for children who are also facing the additional effects of living in poverty. And I'll note one last thing here as well, point that's not always touched on as much. But when we close schools down because it's just simply not safe to keep the students in the classroom without proper cooling mechanisms, we also have this additional dilemma of the fact that a lot of children go to school and that's where they get their breakfast and lunch.
Hmm.
Closed school. So that means that we're also cutting children off from where they get their nutrition from. So that also puts people in a precarious situation with already existing food insecurity. So really, it's just an issue that just further compounds a lot of challenges that low income and rural children are facing on their day to day.
Absolutely. And I remember the Center for American Progress had a webinar recently that you were both on. There's also someone who used to be a teacher in a rural school. And she mentioned that, in a lot of rural communities, they end up being in states where oftentimes the state legislature isn't as willing to give school districts funding for infrastructure. And it's kind of a, help yourselves, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. But because of declining population in rural areas, the tax base just cannot support the kind of funding that's needed to bring their schools up to, you know, anything close to some of the similar standards that you might see in more populated or affluent suburban school districts. And so this isn't just something for low income urban communities. This is a huge issue for rural communities that do not have the ability to self-fund these kinds of infrastructure upgrades. Hailey, I want to ask you, what do you know about how teachers are dealing with unprecedented heat in the classroom?
Yeah, thank you for this question and also for the nod to the webinar. I have to give a shout out to Jess Piper, the teacher who
Mm-hmm.
was in that conversation. She's such an incredible voice in this space. I think it's worth adding to what Autumn has already pointed out that in some cases schools have canceled classes and enacted early dismissals because the temperatures are just too high. From Baltimore to Philly, Milwaukee to Chicago, this is an increasingly pressing concern for more districts across the country, and it means that kids are actively losing instructional time because of dangerously high temperatures. Where teachers are faced with the problem of extreme heat, they're doing whatever they can to help protect their kids and are adopting whatever stopgap measures they have available to them or that they can afford. They're using box fans, opening windows where they are able. Jess, on that webinar pointed out that in the school that she taught at, they were unable to open the windows because of a factory down the road that, was contributing to some of the poor air quality issues that we've talked about. So other folks are closing blinds to create more shaded space. They're using portable ACs where they can or if they can afford them, making sure kids are drinking more water. But a lot of these short-term solutions are really just not sufficient for actually cooling classrooms to a healthy temperature and may even introduce more risk by increasing exposure to outdoor air toxins and particulates, for instance, when windows are open. So at the end of the day, I mean, teachers play a crucial role, but it really can't be only on them to create healthy physical environments for their students. This really is a matter of policy intervention and adequate investment to make those necessary infrastructural upgrades and ensure that both children and the people who care for and educate them are able to access safe and supportive learning spaces.
Absolutely. Well said. And in the next segment, we are going to get to policy. And after we've outlined the problem, we're going to talk about what are the solutions. So don't go away, folks. We'll take a quick commercial break and be right back with more Go Green Radio. Welcome back to Go Green Radio, everybody. So glad that you can join us. We're talking about protecting children from extreme heat in schools. And our guest today couldn't be better. We have Autumn Burton, who is a Senior Associate of Climate, Health, and Environment at the Federation of American Scientists, and Dr. Hailey Gibbs, who's an Associate Director of Early Childhood Policy at the Center for American Progress. Autumn, I want to go to you. What can policy advocacy organizations do to help protect children from extreme heat in schools?
Yeah, Jill, this is a great question. So I would say from my standpoint, working on policy in my day-to-day, I would say there's a few key strategic things that policy advocacy organizations can do on this front. So for one, it's critical for us to continue to make the evidence base about the effects of extreme heat on children's health and well-being clear and readily accessible for people. So at my team, at the Federation of American Scientists, we regularly publish policy memos, fact sheets, ish briefs, and so on that help to make this evidence base more clear. So that way it's understandable for folks why this is an issue that we need to act on with urgency. So we outline a lot of the things that Hailey and I have been discussing throughout this chat here on these different resources that we create. So it's important to do that. And also, as you're making the evidence base clear and accessible, it's essential to focus on the solutions. So we can't just talk about the challenges here, and there are many. We've been discussing quite a few of them throughout our discussion here. But it's important that we make it clear that while, yes, this is a challenge, there's also an array of solutions that are already ready at our disposal to employ. And for that reason, it's important for us to advocate for them and to uplift them to decision makers that can then implement these solutions. And the third key thing I'll say as well, it's important to focus on working together with other advocacy organizations. This is not an issue that makes sense for people to be working in silos. This is an issue of national scale of the utmost urgency. So it's important that advocacy organizations work together to form national coalitions for action. As an example of this, my team at the Federation of American Scientists formed a coalition last year that was co-led by another advocacy organization called Undaunted K-12. And we led this coalition that was comprised of over 20 other national organizations, as well as an array of individuals from across the country. And this coalition focused on developing these policy solutions and sending them directly to the Department of Education, recommending streamlined funding, enhanced data and research, and integrating heat resilience throughout education policies. And throughout this, we stress the importance of the Department of Education to use its national platform and coordinating capabilities to help schools prepare and respond to extreme heat. So even in this more challenging federal political environment that we're currently in, it's now even more important for us to work together and have this coordinated action, especially as we understand that this is an issue of national scale, and therefore it requires stakeholders at all levels of government, at all aspects of our community to be engaged and involved on this front.
Well said, and 100% agree. And speaking of the federal government, Hailey, what are some of the things that we need the federal government to do in order to keep kids safe from heat-related harm at school?
Yeah, I think there are sort of four main buckets that capture the role of the federal government in this crisis, and I have to second that Autumn and her team at FAS have great resources on this topic as well. But I think of this in terms of one, conducting data collection, two, providing funding, three, establishing standardized safety thresholds, and four, supporting coordination and outreach. So we need to be collecting better data about school infrastructure needs across the country, about the conditions that kids are facing in their early learning environments. And that's a responsibility that, under more ideal circumstances, maybe the Department of Education could help collaborate on with local education authorities, schools, and childcare programs for the little ones. We then need the resources of the federal government to help overcome some of the state and local inequities baked into how we fund public schools and especially how we fund infrastructural needs. And that could happen through different kinds of federal grants or emergency funding and targeting resources to hardest hit parts of the country. We also need standards for safe temperatures that are evidence-based to help ensure that kids across the country have access to a safe, healthy learning environment, regardless of geography or circumstance. And finally, we need coordination between agencies and between federal, state, and local governments to help raise awareness about extreme heat and heat risk, to showcase where across the country residents can expect to experience high risk temperatures, and to help communities take proactive steps to ensure that they're protected and they have plans in place to mitigate exposure.
Thank you for that, Haley. That was a great list of things that we can look to our federal government to work on, but in the absence of action, I'm going to go back to you, Autumn, and you gave us a great example of New York, but let's talk more broadly. What role can state governments play in addressing excessive heat in the classrooms as we kind of wait for, you know, with great hope for the federal government to take some action? What role can the state governments play?
Yeah, I would say quite a few of the key policy actions that Haley was just explaining at the federal level, quite a few of those actually can be employed by the states when we look at a high level. Like, for example, the implementation of these heat standards, the facilitation of better coordination across agencies within a given state, as well as the efforts to improve data collection. So it's critical for states to collect data on temperatures inside of classrooms and also systematically employ tracking systems to monitor when school closures are happening as a result of extreme heat. Because we are going to develop these policies, especially in the absence of further federal support, it's essential that they are evidence-based and a direct representation of what people are experiencing. And that, of course, will be driven by improved data collection. So that's, I guess, one bucket there. Another key area that state governments play a role in and need to focus on as well is that a key issue of funding. So it's essential that state governments develop a legislation that requires schools to start budgeting for these infrastructure improvements. So that should include requiring states to look at their current resources and see how they can reallocate funds to ensure that infrastructure improvements are part of this picture. But also that includes as well providing resources for schools in the form of grants, rebates, and also like broad opportunities for private sector partnerships to then help to create these long-term capital investments, and also make sure that investment plans are informed by rising temperatures. And then additionally, I'll add as well that in this broader landscape of different actions that state and local governments can take, we also need to ensure that state and local governments are encouraging and supporting experimentation. I mentioned earlier that New York provides a great model and it's great for states to follow their lead. But at the same time as well, we need to see a broader array of solutions being developed here. So yes, we do definitely need to follow existing models, but we also need to experiment and being open to trying new things because our previous solutions from the decades past aren't relevant anymore. We're entering a brave new world of brave new temperatures, temperatures that are quite extreme and creating really negative outcomes for new and current generations. So for that reason, we need to encourage state and local governments to employ creative solutions to address this crisis.
Absolutely. And, I know that it's on the tip of both of your tongues, but if we're going to root cause for this problem of kids dealing with extreme heat in the classrooms, there's two things going on. First of all is the infrastructure, and we talked about that. We need upgraded infrastructure in American schools. And secondly, let's go to root cause of what's causing the heat to be different than it was in decades past. Greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse effect are real. We've been talking about it for decades, and we need to mitigate that with clean energy so that we are not continuously contributing to the greenhouse effect that is trapping all of this heat. So anyway, Haley, let's pretend that we are waiting for the federal government, and we live in a state where the state legislature isn't, focused on this issue. What can local public policy makers do? What's the role of the local school board?
Yeah, local officials and community members play a significant role in helping to mitigate some of the consequences of extreme heat exposure. They can be monitoring high heat conditions and mandating that schools and employers provide more frequent water breaks and establish cooling areas. They can also designate specific community members, like a heat safety coordinator, to help share information about the risks associated with extreme heat exposure and to provide guidance to teachers and parents about how to ensure that kids are protected. Local school boards can also set policy about allowable temperatures in the school building in their district, and where possible, also dedicate some funding to support access, maybe to some of those more immediate stopgap measures that we've talked about, like portable ACs, fans, shaded structures. I also think, perhaps most critically, local school boards and policymakers can also be strong advocates for their communities and help raise awareness and press the issue with state and federal officials. They are closest to the people that they serve. They are members of the community. Their kids may also be educated in those schools. So they play a really powerful role in voicing the needs of the community.
In communities where it's possible, and Autumn, I'm going to go to you. There are communities that can self-fund through bond measures upgrades to infrastructure, especially HVAC. But even in affluent towns, sometimes the voters feel overtaxed. And so when school districts are talking to voters about passing a bond measure to help them afford the kind of infrastructure upgrades that would protect children, what can they say to help their constituents vote in favor of a bond measure?
Yeah, I would say for sure it's important to lead with the fact that extreme heat has all of these impacts on the health, safety, and well-being of their children, the children of their community, and so on. And by investing in these upgrades into cooling systems, it'll help to ensure that every child has a safe learning environment. So that's one key thing, focus on the health and safety. Also, it's important to highlight these impacts to learning that Hailey and I have been discussing throughout this discussion so far, and how exposure to these high temperatures does reduce learning outcomes. It also reduces longer term performance in school, which then translates to these longer term annual income losses. And when we look at the broader scale, so that's another key part as well. Focusing in on these impacts that it directly has to children, their health, their safety, as well as their ability to learn and succeed in school. And then on top of this as well, I think it's also important to bring it back to costs. When we invest in resilience, that is an investment into the future. It's an investment into better infrastructure. It's an investment into our youth. It's also an investment that will then save us a lot of money in the future because we don't have to worry about paying for expensive maintenance costs or
Mhm.
expensive infrastructure upgrades that could have been much cheaper if we paid for them on the front end. It also helps to lower energy costs when we're investing into more energy efficient cooling solutions as well. So I would say on the whole, if we keep the message centered around this cost effectiveness, this reduction in these health and safety impacts, as well as this being a supportive measure for learning and longer term success, I think that'll definitely help make it clear to people why these are important investments to make, and also how it'll help them to save money in the long run.
Well said. Thank you, Autumn. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we have much more. So don't go away. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. We're talking about something near and dear to so many parents and grandparents and child advocacy people's, heart, and that is protecting our children while they're at school from extreme heat. This is a growing problem in areas of the country where it's new. We've never had to worry about this kind of heat during the school year, but now we do, and we have to deal with it in order to protect our children. Hailey, I want to go to you because, you're working for the Center for American Progress, and you've got your PhD and you've done so many different things in your career. Personally, what motivates you to work on this issue?
Yeah, I love this question. I think that this is such an important area to be working in, and we certainly need more dedicated people in this space fighting this fight. I think one of the things that really drew me to CAP as an organization was that it is a multi-issue organization. So I get to bump elbows with brilliant people doing work that I don't know, very much about, and it's really helped to shape the work that I do, the way that I think about these problems in, really interesting and I hope more holistic ways. On a more personal note, I think as a developmentalist, as someone who has a background in child development, specifically in children's cognitive development, I've always really loved working with kids. I've always been fascinated by this magical transformation that they undergo during
Mhm.
those earliest months and years from tiny, seemingly blobby baby to a walking, talking, interactive person. And that process is supported by the physical and social environments that we provide them with. It doesn't just happen by accident. And so in a sense, I kind of feel like how could you not be motivated to work on this issue?
Mhm.
And I mean, as Autumn already noted, this is about the future of the planet, the future of our society, the well-being of this and the next generation. And so investing in mitigating climate change, protecting children's health, supporting their learning, really creating a foundation for them to thrive in the future, to reduce, some of the costs that we incur as a society in the future. I see those as all sort of integrated goals that are mutually reinforcing. So I think it's so important to really situate early childhood in the context of many different policy issue areas. I think every policy issue area is an early childhood issue. And so I think there's a lot to be gained by putting heads together and thinking of these problems with brilliant people, in coalition who are similarly dedicated to mitigating this crisis and improving the quality of life for everybody.
Beautifully said, Haley. It makes me think about something I read years and years ago, about the founding of what we now know as the Parent Teacher Association, PTA. At the time that it was founded, women didn't have the right to vote, and they organized. There was no social media; it was all through the mail and, writing letters. But they organized into the Congress of Mothers, and their whole focus was policy advocacy for children. They were responsible for, and this feels weird to say out loud, considering what's going on in our country right now, but they advocated for childhood vaccines. They are responsible for things like seatbelt laws that protect children in vehicles. And some of the same things that you described, were some of the same things that motivated those women back then when they couldn't even vote, to influence public policy on behalf of children, with the understanding that children are counting on us. They're absolutely dependent on us, as Autumn mentioned in segment one of this. So thank you for sharing that, Haley. And Autumn, I want to go to you. I don't know about you, but the work I do with the Go Green Initiative, if you'd asked me, when I was a young person, can you see yourself doing this? I would have said, absolutely not. This is not my career trajectory at all. And I don't know if this is what you've always thought you'd be doing, but how is this issue affecting your work and the focus of your career?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Baltimore. So I got to see firsthand what it's like when schools are underinvested in, when you're
Mhm.
dealing with degraded infrastructure. And I have vivid memories of being in middle school and being excited to go back to school. And then, nope, we can't because school's closed today because we don't have
Mm.
air conditioning and we're experiencing a heat wave. So for me, extreme heat, as well as environmental justice at large, are very much issues that are personal to me. Also, like growing up right outside of Baltimore, like I also got to see firsthand, wow, I actually live very close by to one of the most polluted places in the nation, yet I'm not hearing people talk about this. So for me,
Mm.
honestly, like when I was younger, especially when I was in high school, environmental justice and advocating for vulnerable communities from places from people for people who are from places like myself and beyond um really was something that I've been passionate about for a long time. So would I have expected me to be doing exactly what I'm doing right now? Maybe not exactly, but I've always definitely been very passionate about this. And in my current work at the Federation of American Scientists, as I work now to develop these policy solutions for all levels of government that foster resilience to the effects of climate hazards, or rather environmental hazards that are being further intensified by climate change. When I think about resilience, I always think about the importance of focusing on vulnerable communities that are not always at the forefront of decision makers' minds. So as I work to develop policy solutions with my team and our partners, I'm always focused on how we can really put those who are most vulnerable at the forefront. As we've been talking today, children are among those vulnerable populations. So for me, how is this affecting the focus of my career? It just makes me even more um, trained on how we can protect those who are most vulnerable to this hazard that continues to escalate. And it's also of the utmost important for us to have as many people from as many diverse backgrounds as we can possibly have at the decision making table. So that way, the solutions that we developed are rooted in what people actually need and will actually have the
Mhm.
impacts for those who are experiencing the worst effects of environmental hazards and climate change at large.
Beautifully said. I wish that I could give you a hug right now. That was beautifully said, and I really appreciate you bringing that to the forefront. Hailey, I'm going to pivot back to you. Let's give our listeners a to-do list because I know they're fired up right now. What are two or three things that our listeners could do this week or this month to help protect kids from extreme heat at school?
Yeah, three things. Okay. I would say not just this week or this month, but as a continuous initiative. I think especially as kids are now back in school across the country, parents and other members of the community can make sure that they stay engaged with their school boards and parent meetings and local government town halls, making sure that the topic of safe learning environments remains a priority throughout the school year and that school and local officials take proactive measures to keep kids safe. So I think showing up in your community and making sure that your electeds and other folks who have positional authority sort of recognize this as a priority for your community is crucial. Where possible, contributing resources to help teachers purchase fans and portable ACs, which are not cheap, can go a
Mhm.
long way to ensuring that kids can retain instructional time. Both teachers and students are able to protect themselves from some of the more dire, high-risk temperatures. And finally, I think one of the biggest things anyone can do is to raise awareness and make sure that we collectively are talking about the problem of climate change. And as Auburn noted, making sure that vulnerable people and populations are at the front of that conversation. I think it's
Mhm.
way too easy for this issue to fade from our attention as we enter cooler seasons and as so many other things are happening. But the fact of the matter is that climate change is here. Extreme heat is a major but often less prominent consequence compared to other natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires. And we need to be taking action yesterday to help ensure that kids are protected and schools have the resources that they need. So this conversation with Autumn and all of the other conversations that we're having, I think just need to keep going and everyone plays a role in that.
30 seconds, Autumn. What parting thoughts would you like to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, definitely seconding all of Haley's points as well, especially on this aspect of raising awareness. we need to make sure that we are developing policies that represent the evidence and also represent the experiences people are having. And in order to do that, we have to make sure everyone is at the table and informed. And that comes from developing resources for people to read, having discussions like we're having right now, talking to your neighbor, making sure you're involved in the community. But there are a lot of ways we can raise awareness, and it starts with you, and that's the key point there as well. And the last thing I'll say as well is on this topic of awareness and evidence. My team at the Federation of American Scientists, we're here to support people, decision makers, anyone who's interested in learning more about this issue. And if you are interested in reading some of our publications, we have an array of them that talk about the effects of extreme heat on vulnerable populations, including children, as well as how we can foster resilience at large with a focus on those who are most directly affected by this issue.
Thank you, Autumn, and thank you, Hailey, for being with us. What a great show. What a great conversation. Thank you to our listeners as well. We'll be here same time, same place next week with more Go Green Radio. Until then, have a wonderful week and do